Call me basic, but Spider-Man has always been my favorite superhero. From his unique powers to his iconic costume, to his sense of humor even in the face of danger, what's not to like about him? The character is a beloved staple of pop culture for a reason. And I can't help but, alright, let's be real. You're not here for a detailed history of my connection with this character. You're here for the hot take.
The power of the sun in the palm of my hand.
You saw that title and thumbnail and have probably already made up your mind and hit the dislike button, yet there's this morbid curiosity that's keeping you from turning this garbage off, because it's not every day that you see someone go against the very popular opinion that Spider-Man 2 is not only better than the first, and thus a top contender for the best Spider-Man movie, but also one of the best superhero movies ever made. Surely, only someone who's completely insane or is some sort of contrarian would challenge that widespread perception, right? My memories of the movie were fond enough for me to list it as my second favorite comic book movie fairly recently on my Twitter, but I hadn't rewatched it in a while, and I wanted to see whether it really was on the same level of quality, writing-wise, as Into the Spider-Verse. So I sat down and rewatched it with fresh eyes, trying to set aside my nostalgic bias for it, and I have to be honest, I now notice a lot of issues with the characterization and plot that I didn't see before, and they really took me out of the movie.
What?
With this video, I will be making the case that the story of Spider-Man 2, when you give it more than a casual glance, does not hold up very well due to its foundation being built on numerous plot holes, contrivances, and inconsistencies that other stories have recently been criticized for, such as every film in the Star Wars sequel trilogy, The Dark Knight Rises, Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, Game of Thrones Season 8, and The Last of Us Part 2. Now, if you love Spider-Man 2, as most people do, and haven't really noticed any issues with it in regards to plot holes or internal consistency, and you'd prefer to remain ignorant of them, that's perfectly fine. There is no shame in wanting to avoid looking at or hearing criticism directed at something that you enjoy and do not want tainted for you. And it's also fine if the lens through which I perceive media isn't compatible with yours. I view stories not through the lens of an aspiring filmmaker, but as an aspiring writer, someone who wants to tell stories that will stand up strongly to this sort of scrutiny. But of course I understand that there are more aspects to filmmaking than just a good script. And in my conclusion, I will be talking about how I think Spider-Man 2 is actually a solid case study for how a very flawed film writing-wise can be carried by highly competent directing, acting, editing, cinematography, and pacing, and manage to get most people, even the plot hole sleuths like myself, to miss the numerous writing errors that are present in the story. If you want to just skip to that section because you don't care about plot hole-centric criticism, the timestamp is here. And now, without further ado, let's dive into a little critique of Spider-Man 2, starting with one of the key aspects to the film's emotional stakes: the romance. The Peter Parker and Mary Jane romance was always the weakest link of the Raimi trilogy for me, but it didn't drag down the first movie the way it noticeably does in the second. MJ's first scene shows her demanding a school bus driver to stop so Peter can get on board while everyone else is laughing at him, quickly establishing her as a kind and compassionate person. We later see that her father is verbally abusive towards her, which garners her even more sympathy from the viewer. And generally speaking, she's shown to be pretty supportive. The way her relationship with Peter progresses from one beat in the story to the next makes sense, and Kirsten and Toby's chemistry is actually pretty solid throughout the film.
Don't make me look ugly.
That's impossible.
Wow, great reflexes.
Hey, you have blue eyes. I didn't notice without your glasses. You just get contacts?
You're awesome in all the school plays.
Really?
Yeah. I cried like a baby when you played Cinderella.
Peter, that was first grade.
Well, even so.
It's no surprise that this scene is so iconic. The romance between MJ and Peter just kinda works, which makes the moment that she tells Peter she loves him at the end believable. Of course, the events of the film end up informing Peter's decision to be nothing more than a friend to her, which allows the ending of that movie to remain impactful to this day. In Spider-Man 2, 2 years have passed since that moment, and MJ has not moved on from Peter at all, seeming to have forgotten what he said to her.
I will always be your friend.
Only your friend?
That's all I have to give.
Harry can see this, and he tells Peter that she's clearly still into him in his first scene.
She's waiting for you, pal.
What do you mean?
The way she looks at you or doesn't look at you. However you want to look at it.
The first one-on-one exchange that Peter has with MJ shows her being very flirtatious with him, only for her to then tell him,
I'm seeing somebody now.
You mean like a boyfriend?
Well, like, I like him. What?
Nothing. That's good, you know? Companionship.
Maybe more than that.
More?
I don't know.
It seems as though she's attempting to make him jealous, which winds up working because he promises to make it to her play the next night. Of course, this ends up not working out due to him having to intervene in a crime taking place on the way to the play, and when he later tries to apologize to her multiple times for being unable to make it, she just acts dismissively towards him and decides to get engaged with the guy that she mentioned seeing earlier, who turns out to be J. Jonah Jameson's son, John. So either she's telling the truth, and John isn't her boyfriend yet, and he's just a guy that she's seeing and thinks she likes, making her rushed engagement to him an obvious ploy to make Peter jealous, or she's downplaying how long she's been seeing John as a means of letting Peter think that she still might be available so he can pursue her and she can leave John. Either of those interpretations makes MJ a manipulative person, and she only gets worse from here. MJ was present when Harry and Peter had this exchange.
So where you been, pal? You don't return my calls.
I've been busy.
Peter is too busy to even keep up with his best friend, which anyone who doesn't know about his double life would just figure to be a natural effect of being a low-income college student with a job. Possibly even two. Oh, well, maybe she just doesn't know what his financial situation is. Bullshit! Literally, the last scene of the movie is her showing up at Peter's apartment without having to be told where it is at any point in the film. So it's safe to infer that she's known about this shitty apartment he's been living in this entire time, which should tell her fucking everything about how strapped he is financially, and in turn, how busy he would probably be just to make ends meet and how little money he has to blow on a ticket to a play. She should be aware of how busy he is, and he hasn't been able to make any commitments because of that, and it just so happened that something came up the one time he did. But you would think that she would understand that that's just life. Shit happens. Any number of things could have stopped Peter from being able to come, but there's this idealized version of him that she's made up in her head that will always be able to make it when he makes a plan with her. And when the real Peter isn't able to live up to that unrealistic fantasy, she lashes out at him, despite knowing how full his plate is. To make matters worse, Peter would have had a totally valid excuse for not being able to make it to her play. A car literally wrecked his bike on the way there. Even leaving out the fact that he had to intervene in a crime, Peter would have had a very easy to prove excuse for not being able to make it. But he just doesn't, for no apparent reason. Mary Jane's treatment of Peter becomes even less reasonable when you remember the first movie ending with the implication that she had figured out that he is Spider-Man due to the way that he kisses. But if that's the case, then why is she treating Peter like this? She knows he's busy as it is, even if he isn't a crime-fighting superhero, but if her suspicions about him are correct, then she has even less justification for reacting in this way to him missing her play this one time or being unavailable in general. If anything, you would think she'd take his lack of availability as just another clue that indicates that he's the webhead after all. But she spends most of the second movie acting as though she lacks any such suspicions. For much of the film's runtime, it seems as though they completely forgot about that subtext, or just didn't care to stay consistent with it. A character is hinted to know more about someone close to her than she's letting on, and then acts in a way that suggests she doesn't, and then that person who's close to her fails to provide a simple and truthful explanation for himself so we can have some forced drama. I wonder if we've seen this trope recently in something else. Of course, the movie eventually remembers that she did figure out who Peter was in the one scene we see her with her fiancé that we're to believe she only just recently met. She just randomly gets this urge to kiss him similarly to how she once kissed Spider-Man, and in the middle of it she seems to have this epiphany that leads her to arrange a meetup with Peter so she can kiss him again. Because I guess the one from the first film's ending just wasn't enough for her to be certain that it was him who saved her from a gang of would-be rapists? Like, seriously, why has it taken her this long to remember this, and why does it feel like it's just come out of nowhere? Well, the answer is because they needed her to be present when Doc Ock finds Peter so that he can use her as a tool for an ultimatum with the end goal of obtaining tritium for his second fusion reactor. Yeah, don't worry, we'll get to that eventually too. To top it all off, after confirming that Peter is the same guy who saved her life on 4 different occasions at this point, she says,
I think I always knew. All this time.
Then why the fuck have you been so hard on him for the first 3/4 of this movie, you asshole? He's clearly got tons of shit on his plate. Do you not understand that not everything revolves around you? Peter finally gives her the explanation that he tried rehearsing into an Idell payphone earlier in the film and drops her off to be picked up by her fiancé. And apparently she goes along with the plan for the wedding for God knows how much time passes between the climax and the epilogue. And then on the day of the wedding, she just fucking leaves her fiancé at the altar. Like, it would have been one thing if John was depicted as kind of an asshole that wasn't concerned about her, but literally all the screen time that he gets in this film seems to indicate that he's actually a really good guy who's just ended up being led on by this crazy person. I just love the idea that we're supposed to be okay with this dude getting humiliated at his wedding simply because it means MJ's running off to be with the main character. someone who has told her time and time again that he can't be with her. The movie even tries to play it off as a joke when all I can really do is feel bad for this poor guy. I really feel for him. We haven't seen him doing anything wrong throughout the entire film besides getting engaged to someone that some guy he's never met has feelings for that he can't pursue. Boy, sure would suck if anyone willing to defend Mary Jane here got offended over this deleted scene from Captain Marvel. Jesus Christ, Mary Jane, why are you just the worst? What is this music? Are we supposed to be smiling at this image here? MJ, you've literally just ditched a good person at the altar after using him for an entire movie to get with a guy who you've been mistreating while suspecting him of being a crime-fighting superhero. On top of being a broke college student who has to work multiple jobs just to pay his rent.
Go get him, Tiger.
Oh, now you're okay with him putting his duties as Spider-Man before you. What changed, huh? You can't say you just didn't know that he was Spider-Man before, since you said that you've known all along. If only you had been so understanding the entire fucking film. To be fair, from what we see of MJ's life in the first movie, it's understandable why she would turn out to be such a needy, dysfunctional person. So these unlikable characteristics of hers may not come from a vacuum, but rather be justified by cause and effect. We still shouldn't be rooting for the person she is in the film. We should be rooting for her to overcome her trauma and recognize her own worth as a person that her abusive father never recognized. Apparently there's an extended cut of the film that has a scene that actually shows they tried to develop this, but the movie still constantly glosses over how manipulative she is. So no matter what edit of the movie you watch, she never ends up learning anything and instead just perpetuates the cycle of emotional abuse. If we were to find out that Mary Jane's grandfather was abusive to her father, that would add context to why he's ended up this way himself, but it wouldn't suddenly excuse or justify his treatment of her, and the same reasoning should be applied to her. It really feels like they just didn't have an idea for what to do with what the first movie's ending had set up, but they had to give Mary Jane something to do in this story before she becomes the third act damsel in distress for the second movie in a row. So they just had her forget about this earth-shattering realization she had so we can have the super forced and artificial conflict that is constantly propelling the story of this movie forward. Seriously, MJ is not a good person in this film, constantly toying with two different people's emotions out of her own selfish desires, and the chemistry between Toby and Kirsten has also noticeably plummeted off a cliff in between film productions. This scene, in isolation, is pretty great. But the fact that the person it's being directed to is as toxic as she is makes it very difficult to actually root for Peter to follow this desire that's depicted as part of the core of his character. And this romance subplot takes up a good chunk of the film. Even when the Peter and MJ romance is not the exclusive focus of the scene, it has a constant effect on the story. It's one of the main reasons for Peter having this inner turmoil about being a superhero while also being directly correlated with the stakes of the latter two fights between him and Doc Ock, albeit more so with the train fight sequence where Spidey's primary objective is to defeat Doc Ock so he can rescue her, than with the final fight, where it's not just her life at stake, but also the rest of New York's. However, what's driving the personal stakes in that final confrontation is Mary Jane, and it's kind of hard to become emotionally invested in those stakes because of how unsympathetic she is. A romance that has this much importance to the story needs to do much better than this. The Mary Jane we saw in the first movie deserved better, and Spider-Man 2 completely butchered her. Now consider everything I've brought up and then rewatch the film, and try to pay attention to what emotional response you have as a result of the music that accompanies each scene with Mary Jane, along with the shot composition and editing.
You want to say something? Do you love me or not?
I don't.
Kiss me.
Kiss you.
I need to know something. I've always been standing in your doorway. Isn't it about time somebody saved your life?
The film, and especially Danny Elfman's score, are very effective at evoking the intended emotional response out of the viewer, even when I don't think it's warranted by the content of the writing. Good old movie magic, as they say. Alright, so the romance in the movie sucks, but surely the plot centering around Doc Ock is still good, right? Surely it can't possibly have even more issues than Mary Jane has. That's just silly. Doc Ock is one of the best supervillains in any comic book movie. There's no way I could come up with any valid criticisms against Doc Ock, right?
That is false.
For the sake of clarity, I'll be referring to Otto himself by his name and Otto under the influence of his arms as Doc Ock. Think of it like how Darth Vader and Anakin Skywalker are treated as different characters. No, I am not taking issue with the idea of Otto being able to build a machine that can create a miniature sun powered by tritium, which in real life is a gas and in this film is some golden crystallized substance. I am not here to insist that this movie needs to follow every last law of physics to the letter, and I can suspend my disbelief and accept these obvious breaks from the real world in a comic book movie. Likewise, I am not going to raise any issues regarding exactly how heavy Doc Ock's tentacles are. They're already resistant to magnetism and heat, so I imagine they're made up of some fictional comic booky metal that has those properties on top of being light enough for a person to be able to stand upright while wearing them. These are honestly the least of my issues with Doc Ock and the plot that revolves around him. So what are my actual criticisms in relation to this plot? Well, first things first, let's just point out the fact that Otto just builds this machine that has the potential of wiping out a city if the slightest thing goes wrong in his apartment in the middle of New York at most 3 years after 9/11 happened. There's apparently debate over whether 9/11 did happen in the Raimiverse, and I think either side can make a strong case, but for the sake of steel-manning the movie, I'll go along with the idea that it didn't. Even if this version of New York never had 9/11 happen, it is still patently absurd that Otto would have gotten the permits that he would have needed to legally conduct an experiment like this in the middle of the city. You cannot just do something like this without first going to the government and telling them about it so they can give you the go-ahead. It would make more sense if this was entirely a secret operation, something happening underground perhaps, away from the public eye. But no, apparently the city of New York saw that a guy was going to start up an artificial sun in his apartment, which could potentially draw anything made out of metal into it and cause a catastrophic amount of damage and loss of life, and they were just like,
nah, it'll be fine.
Why aren't they doing this in a more remote area? Why does Otto not even have a protective barrier for his guests observing this experiment? Why is absolutely no one concerned about safety here? If they just didn't get the permits first, then why aren't there any legal repercussions for Harry or Oscorp after this dangerous experiment predictably goes awry? What the fuck is Father Lantom doing here? Doesn't he have a blind orphan to raise? Why is Rosie still standing here? Why hasn't she cleared out of the area like everyone else? What is she doing in this exact spot? Why does she react to watching a window smash by just screaming without looking away so that the glass doesn't get pulled into her eye? Why isn't she at least trying to protect her face with her arms, which is an instinctual reflex that one would have to consciously resist the urge to do when glass is flying at their face? How does getting glass in her eye instantly kill her anyways? Oh, but these are just nitpicks. It's not like Otto's wife dying has a huge effect on his psyche or anything. It's not like it's a big deal for an esteemed fusion scientist like Otto Octavius to run such a risky experiment out of his loft. It's not like this scene affects how he becomes Doc Ock. Nope, they're all nitpicks. Doesn't it just suck when the setup for your story is so full of contrivances that the foundation that your plot is built upon is made up of jelly? It sure is great to know that we're willing to criticize all stories with these sorts of issues, even when we like them.
They'll act like you heard of us or something.
Anyway, the next scene shows a team of surgeons attempting to remove the tentacles from Otto's body, only to be slaughtered by them while he's still unconscious. I don't have much of an issue with this scene at all. It's one of the best ones in the film, in fact.
So good.
From the way that tension builds up to the moment that the tentacles start attacking everyone in the room to the absolutely terrifying ways that they kill these doctors, the directing in this scene is on point. Part of me does wonder why some of the doctors that Ock kills towards the end of the scene are still in this operating room a full minute or so after he started killing everyone. Like, you would think that the room would have been cleared out at this point, but I could also buy the idea that they were in a part of the room where an exit wasn't accessible and that they would have had to run past the tentacles to get out, but were too scared to do that. I'll also give credit where it's due in that there's at least 1 or 2 doctors you can see actually run for the exit in the scene and apparently make it out alive. So it's not like these doctors are being written without any sort of self-preservation instincts. Part of me does think that the scene is a bit out of place with the rest of the movie in terms of tone, seeing as it wouldn't be out of place in a horror film. But it's still a really well executed scene, and it doesn't stick out quite as badly as a certain other comic book movie I can think of. Right after Otto wakes up and delivers a gloriously cheesy no upwards to the ceiling, he walks out of the hospital and the scene transitions over to him arriving at this area somewhere in the docks, and it's not something that immediately jumps out at you, but the first of many issues relating to the logistics of how this plot can work with this version of Doc Ock shows up here. Right after Otto leaves the hospital and sends a car flying through the air before it could run him over, he hears the sound of sirens approaching and then books it out of the area. Maybe the sirens weren't for him, but did no one in New York try calling the cops on him? Or were the cops called on him, but they somehow managed to lose track of a guy that doesn't appear to move at a pace that could outrun a police car or helicopter? You would think they'd already be on their way, because you'd imagine that one or more of the surviving doctors that ran out of the operating room would have called 911. So he doesn't have much of a head start, and he can't exactly blend in. It should pretty much be impossible for the police to lose him, and yet they do. It would be one thing if he moved around through abandoned subway tunnels or the sewers, but we never see him do that in this film, nor do we get any hints of that occurring. This is a plot hole that frequently comes up in this film, and I'm going to be sure to point it out every time. Oh, but let me guess, that's not an actual writing error, since most people do not know what a police helicopter is. The next that we see of Doc Ock is him brooding about the loss of his wife and dream for revolutionizing renewable energy. He slowly realizes that his tentacles are talking to him, as well as the fact that the inhibitor chip that was supposed to prevent them from taking control over him has been fried. He is then convinced that his experiment wasn't a failure because of the fact that he was able to create an artificial sun, and so he decides to build a new fusion reactor in this abandoned building at the docks. But he needs money to buy the parts for that sort of thing. Some have questioned why Ock needs to steal money to buy parts rather than just stealing the parts, but I imagine it's because he would need to get the parts from different sellers, which would require him to pull off multiple heists, whereas if he just steals the money for the parts, he only needs to pull off one heist. The scene is also well acted by Alfred Molina, and the story's progression with Ock so far makes sense, so I don't really have any issue with this particular scene. It's worth noting that it takes place only 6 minutes or so after the hospital scene and moves the plot along fairly quickly without feeling rushed either. It also leads straight into the next scene, where Peter and Aunt May are at a bank trying to get a loan from Jeff Winger, and this is where the Ock plot rapidly begins showing cracks. I remember thinking that this was a pretty cool fight sequence, even though it wasn't quite as cool as the one on the train, so when I rewatched the scene on YouTube, I was kind of flabbergasted at the number of issues I completely missed before. I can honestly say that there's more issues in this bank sequence than there are in the entirety of Into the Spider-Verse. The first thing worth mentioning is that Doc Ock has now acquired a trench coat and hat completely out of nowhere. I'm not saying that it's impossible for him to acquire one, but consider what I said earlier about the cops not following him or being called on him as he made his way to the docks. And remember that that same issue probably applied to him leaving the docks to get these articles of clothing in the first place. It is better than him not having a disguise at all though, and I wouldn't say we necessarily needed a scene dedicated to him just getting his new clothes. It is worth noting that his tentacles aren't retractable, as I noticed that as soon as he rips off a layer of his coat, they appear to still be sticking out of him. But that's not an issue in and of itself, it's just a key observation to make. I'm just glad that there's somewhat of an explanation for how he was able to get to this bank without being spotted by the police, which is more than can be said for every single other scene that he's in. So Ock uses his tentacles to rip the door to the vault right out of the wall. Man, CGI has come a long way since this movie, and already I have a couple of questions. Isn't it unusual for a bank to have its vault in an open area like this where everyone can see it? I'm not saying it's logically impossible, but isn't that kind of a glaring security issue? Don't most banks keep their vaults somewhere underground or in a back area? The second thing that bothers me is that Peter and May are established to be no more than 20 feet away from where Ock's standing, and neither of them react to this for 10 whole seconds until Peter's spider sense finally goes off. I guess both of them are going deaf or they're just that oblivious. Not as oblivious as the security guard though. Has a gun that works just fine at range, decides to close the distance with someone who is clearly very dangerous at close quarters. This is dumb enough as it is, but wouldn't it suck if two other guards did the exact same thing? Oh. This is a huge pet peeve of mine when movies do this trope. Don't have people who are armed with guns forget that they have guns so that they can get knocked out like this. It's really stupid. It's always stupid. Always has been, always will be. So Spider-Man swings in, Ock begins throwing bags of coins at him, and Spidey sends one right back at him, hitting him in the chest and knocking him into a wall. Somehow, he's still standing up on his own 2 feet after getting hit in the chest with a bag full of gold coins thrown at him, which should fucking hurt and possibly break a few important bones in his chest, but he just shrugs it off. It's something I never really thought about before, but now I can't ignore it. Doc Ock is not a superhuman. As a matter of fact, he's the weakest Raimi villain, not in terms of characterization, but in terms of power level and durability. He has his exoskeleton with 4 artificially intelligent robotic tentacles and nothing else, while Norman and Harry Osborn are enhanced by the Goblin formula, Sandman is made out of sand and can absorb most forms of damage, and Venom is, well... But Ock simply has no in-universe justification for why he's able to take the damage he takes in this movie. To clarify, I get that Spider-Man always pulls his punches because he has a moral code against killing, which he's very capable of if he punches with full force, so that's not an issue in and of itself. The issue arises from the plausibility that Ock has the pain tolerance and durability to take as many hits as he does and still get back up. Even when you're fighting someone of average human strength, you can only take so many hits to the face before you go down. A lot of older movies didn't account for this, but that's not an excuse. He would need to have an established established history of boxing or something to that effect to explain how he's able to tolerate this kind of pain, but that's never mentioned in the whole film. You could argue that since the exoskeleton is attached to his spine, that it could make his nervous system more resistant to feeling pain to a certain degree, but pain is just a signal sent to our brain warning us of damage to our body. Damage can still be done to us without us feeling it, and the human body can only take so much damage before it can't function anymore. So if there isn't an in-universe explanation for how Ock can tank so much damage, then it's a pretty big issue, as it allows the fight scenes to go on for as long as they do and allow Ock to get the upper hand on Spidey when he should already be down for the count. And it's not like Ock getting knocked out would have incapacitated the tentacles as well, because they were still active while he was unconscious in the operating room. You could have him knocked out and then his tentacles would have to carry him away and do all the fighting for themselves, which would have been kinda neat to see if I'm being honest. Anyway, Ock lands a hit on Spidey because he's distracted by his wrist not shooting webs. Ock then goes to pick up Spidey off the ground and restrains his arms with 2 of his tentacles while using the other 2 to try crushing Spider-Man's head. This implies that from the very beginning of this fight, Ock is working with intent to kill Spidey. Keep this moment in mind, I am not done with it yet. I guess this gets Spidey's powers to start working again because then he webs 2 different desks and pulls them towards Ock. Interesting that there's still lots of people inside the bank that haven't evacuated due to the dangerous fight happening in here, but at least they're ducking for cover instead of just standing around, so it's not too terrible. Now watch this part here. Look at where Doc Ock is in relation to the window he's about to get thrown out of. That thing is, what, 30 feet away at least? He gets hit by this desk with enough force to send him flying back that entire distance, through that window, then through this large outdoor electrical junction box, which is really hard to knock down by the way, and then into a taxi cab so hard that the driver's side of the damn thing lifts up off the ground for a second. Remember, Doc Ock does not have an established superhuman durability. As far as we're concerned, he shouldn't be able to survive something like this, making this yet another clear example of Doc Ock's plot armor. These kinds of things are not only bad when Ray suddenly starts being able to wield the Force at the level that she does in The Force Awakens, guys. Anyway, the police arrive at the scene and we finally get to see how Doc Ock, a regular person whose only source of armor will be the metal harness over his abdomen, and whatever shielding his tentacles may give him, fares against New York's finest. Doc Ock is very lucky that only the least trigger-happy cops in all of NYPD are here, especially given all the time that passes that one of his tentacles reaches into the crowd while they just stand there and do nothing. Man, all cops in this film really are bastards. By the way, it's rather hilarious that of all the people in this crowd of onlookers who still haven't cleared from the area to get grabbed by Ock, it's the one person closest to Spider-Man. We then cut to the inside of an office in a building adjacent to the bank, where we establish that whenever Ock's using his tentacles to get up a building, it causes impact tremors and makes noise. That makes sense. Hope they stay consistent with that. Cut back to outside, Spidey lands on the building right in front of Ock and tells him to hand over May. Ock makes it seem like he'll do just that, but then drops May. Now, in the time that passes between Ock dropping May and hitting Spider-Man, I'm going to just say hit him over and over again until Ock finally hits him. Hit 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 him!
Hit him on the head!
Ock, who is established earlier in this scene to have no qualms with killing people, just stops what he's doing and stares at Spider-Man so that May can be saved. Fucking hilarious. Now, because of how I'm pointing out all these things about this scene, surely you'd think I'd take issue with May being able to grab hold of the statue's hand with her umbrella, but not really, because I understand that it's there to set up a bit of comedic relief that's just the right amount of cheesy for me. But I know that some might take issue with it, and it kind of is a bit contrived, but it's a contrivance that I can give somewhat of a pass, unlike the others I'm noticing in this scene. Of course, Ock has grabbed Spidey with one of his tentacles again and is repeatedly slamming him against the wall, causing chunks of the building to fall down onto the street. Oh hey look, it's a subtle Stan Lee cameo. Let's see here, Ock still got Spidey grabbed, looks like he's had a hold on him for quite a while, and holy shit! Fat Geralt wants to know your location, Spidey. Okay, getting your head yanked straight into a right cross like that will just about guarantee an instantaneous knockout. Look at how Spidey pivoted his entire torso into that move. Pulled punches or not, superhuman strength or not, Ock should absolutely be unconscious at this point. Anyway, May is losing her grip on her umbrella, so Spidey starts rushing up the wall, and we get our first moment where Doc Ock is a ninja in this movie. No longer do his tentacles make sound as he climbs a building, which he would probably have to be doing to keep up with Spidey here, or perhaps they can just grow extra long when he needs them to. Again, Ock's got a pretty good grip on Spidey throughout this fall here, then proceeds to smash him into a window before then flinging him into a building across the street. Aunt May has her cheesy comic relief moment, nice little bit of levity here. Interesting that we can't see Ock in this shot here when we know that he should be, given where he was when he threw Spidey across the street. I guess he must have booked it after doing that. Nope! He just uses his sporadic ninja powers to get up to where May is so he can grab her. Again, his tentacles cause impact tremors and make noise whenever the film decides. Also, let's just rewind the scene a bit to take note of how far away Spidey and Ock were from May when Spidey got flung across the street. Pretty far down, as you can see. They started just a floor below her, then appeared to fall at least 20 floors by the time Spidey gets flung. Then, when Spidey looks out across the street, suddenly her and Ock are only a couple of floors above him. Just wanted to say that while this seems like a nitpick, it does ultimately allow Spider-Man to reach Ock and May much more easily than if it stayed consistent. The only other explanation for this would be if Ock simply climbed back down all 20 floors in the short time it took May to scream and get Spidey's attention, which I also find impossible in its own number of ways. And then, at long last, we arrive at the creme de la creme of this nightmare of an action sequence. What you are about to see is going to retroactively fuck this scene, and both of the later fight scenes between Spider-Man and Doc Ock, in more ways than you could possibly hope to imagine. Ladies and gentlemen, introducing the Holdo maneuver of the entire movie. This fucking thing was here this whole time. I want you to realize that throughout this entire fight scene, in all of the times that Ock had a grip on Spider-Man, or even landed a hit on him with one of his tentacles, that he actually had a blade hidden up at least one of them, and he just decided to not use it until now. My question is why? Why introduce this thing? Why establish that it exists? Why confirm that this entire fight could have ended before it even started? Why are you using this slow-ass method of killing Spider-Man that's going to give him more opportunities to escape than just sticking this blade through his head or his heart? Why don't you use it any of the other times that you have him grabbed and being slammed into walls and windows? Why didn't you hit him with it while he was distracted by saving a falling Aunt May? Why do you even have this big-ass blade in your tentacle? What purpose would it serve in your artificial sun experiment? Were you planning on stabbing the sun? Is this the only tentacle that has a blade, or does another tentacle have one? How about 2 other tentacles having one? What if all 4 tentacles have one? Why aren't you deploying this against your opponent at literally all times? You had intent to kill from the very beginning of this fight. You would think that if you were a supervillain fistfighting someone that you were intending on killing, someone who landed multiple devastating hits against you, and you had a knife at your disposal, you would think that you would have no qualms in pulling out that knife and using it against them at all times. A knife will always give you a serious edge in any close quarters fight against an unarmed opponent. Well, except for this one at least.
My weakness is small knives.
However, unlike that particular crook, Doc Ock has much more than one small knife. He has 4 robotic tentacles and a fucking spear coming out of one of them. Can you even imagine how useful this thing would have been for him throughout this entire fight? Why did you do this, Raimi? Oh, and let me be perfectly clear here. By comparing the tentacle blade to the Holdo maneuver, I'm not saying that it single-handedly ruins the movie, because I don't think that the Holdo maneuver single-handedly ruined The Last Jedi. That movie had loads of issues even without the Holdo maneuver occurring anyways, and it wouldn't have single-handedly ruined that movie if the rest of it was really solid. The reason that I'm comparing the tentacle blade to the Holdo maneuver is because its mere existence has severe effects on the stakes of each fight scene with Doc Ock, much like the Holdo maneuver does with space battles in Star Wars. Another, and more direct comparison, would be to Pacific Rim. Towards the end of the second act of the movie, there is a fight between a flying kaiju called Otachi and a kaiju fighting mech called Gypsy Danger. For much of the fight, Gypsy is struggling against Otachi in a close quarters battle where the 2 pilots inside the mech start out wailing on the kaiju with a freighter ship before spending most of the fight simply hitting the kaiju with the mech's bare fists. Once Otachi begins flying upwards with Gypsy in its claws, one of the co-pilots says that they are out of options because both of their plasma cannons are empty. However, the other co-pilot, Mako, points out that they still have one option left: a sword. They then swing the sword through the kaiju, slashing it in half instantaneously. Had Mako, who we know is aware of the sword, brought up the idea of using this thing at the very start, rather than waiting until the last moment, the fight would have been over much more quickly. But the film wants the dramatic tension of the mech being taken almost out of atmosphere before this happens. So Mako decides it would be better to hit the kaiju with a ship and the mech's bare fists, rather than a sharp weapon that can be used to heavily damage it instantly, to the detriment of herself and her co-pilot. The tentacle blade's existence is representative of the exact same issue. A character always having access to an extremely useful resource, be it a tool, weapon, or just some form of knowledge, that they just choose not to use for no given reason. It's something that could have been used this entire time, but it also disappears for most of the fucking fight. So congratulations, you not only have a Holdo maneuver in your movie, but the same issue is also the equivalent to the disappearing knife from the throne room fight. Anyways, back to the scene. So Doc Ock has shown himself to be pretty durable throughout this whole fight, but Aunt May knows his secret weakness: umbrellas. May hits Ock with a one-handed swing from her umbrella, Ock drops May, Spidey jumps after her, and then the cops finally decide to start firing at Ock, but of course he's too high up for them to hit with their pistols. Now what's funny to me is that right before Ock drops May for the first time, he's consistently shown to be holding 2 bags full of stolen money, but after he drops May and attacks Spidey, he no longer has these bags with him. They're just gone, and they don't reappear until after he drops May for the last time, and the police start shooting at him. So by all logic, because the bags of money disappeared from his hands, he must have dropped them so he could fight Spider-Man, so he should no longer have the money that he stole, so now he shouldn't be able to buy those parts for his new fusion reactor. But now, the money has returned out of thin air. Also, it seems like the police just give up on pursuing him completely as soon as he rounds the corner of the building.
Must have been the wind.
It's very cute that the film thinks cops would do that, but they have these things called cars and helicopters, and they would not have any difficulty with following Ock if they just used them. Again, we have an issue concerning the cops just refusing to do their fucking jobs about the murderous maniac with robotic tentacles that's somehow capable of going toe-to-toe with a superhero. This is only the second time that Ock is shown to be able to just get away from the police with no problem, and believe it or not, there's even more of these issues as we progress. This entire fight sequence is an utter disaster from a logistics standpoint. There's barely anything redeemable about it. The first fight between Spider-Man and Doc Ock falls apart insanely quickly once you actually pay attention to what's going on. And I don't know about you, but the setup for this plot involving the second fusion reactor isn't looking great. So the next we see of Doc Ock is him in his lair with several crates worth of parts for his second fusion reactor. For a scene with absolutely no dialogue that exists solely to show that he's working on a second fusion reactor, I have so many questions that are going to be left unanswered for the rest of the movie. Who sold this stuff to him? Where did he get it from? How did he order it? How did he then have all of the stuff brought to this condemned, half-sunken building without raising any eyebrows? You're all aware that this shit can't just come out of a vacuum, right? There was someone that Doc Ock had to buy all of the stuff from, and then he needed to have it delivered to this abandoned building. Unless we're to believe he carried each container there himself. Ock is the most conspicuous person in all of New York. He no longer has a way of concealing his tentacles, and his name, face, and criminal activities are going to be all over the news at this point. I mean, it's not like we have to infer that. That's literally shown in the film. Did the FedEx driver tasked with delivering all these parts just not give a shit about how suspicious this all is? Or did no one seriously notice the robotic tentacle man hauling numerous massive crates across New York City and into these docks? Seriously, I don't need every plot point explained in full detail, but it would have been really nice to at least have something to go off of, but we have nothing. Ock's resources just seemingly spawn out of thin fucking air, with no reasonable explanation for how he acquired them or had them moved here in sight. It's not as extreme as the ambiguity of where the First Order gets their resources, or how Palpatine was able to have so many Star Destroyers with Death Star cannons built on this remote planet, but it is the same type of problem. It was really bad in the sequel trilogy, and it's bad here too. I know that it seems nitpicky to ask questions like these, but the entire rest of the movie hinges on Doc Ock having a second fusion reactor built, and if that aspect of the story cannot make sense, then the rest of the film is going to suffer for it. The bags of stolen money that he used to buy this stuff vanished into thin air, and then inexplicably returned when the fight scene was over. At numerous points already, the cops have inexplicably failed to catch up to him, or refused to continue pursuing him, or even just sending a helicopter to follow him, and now he's inexplicably been able to get all the parts that he shouldn't have been able to buy in the first place delivered to this location without anyone knowing. It's not too late to still tell a coherent story with such a shoddy foundation, but everyone who is grasping these issues here should be extremely worried. Extreme contrivances and plot holes like these happening at this frequency this early into the plot tend to have a nasty domino effect, and nothing encapsulates this phenomenon better than the next time we see Ock. After he finishes building his second, larger fusion reactor, he mentions,
"Just one more little chore."
Cut to Harry Osborn's penthouse, where as he steps out onto his balcony, we hear the impact tremors of Ock's tentacles again, now that the film wants to build up suspense instead of just have Ock surprise the viewer with his sick ninja skills. Of course, this just begs the question, yet again, as to how Doc Ock got here without drawing any police attention, especially now that we've seen the Daily Bugle state in a headline that the police have expanded the manhunt for him. It's just fucking comical how incompetent the cops are in this movie. Apparently, Ock traveled through all of New York without any citizens noticing him and his large robotic tentacles, because if they had, you would think that at least one person would call 911 on him. But nope, again, he's fine. Doc Ock knocks Harry to the ground and tells him he needs more tritium, to which Harry responds,
More tritium? Are you crazy? You'll destroy the city!
Keep that in mind, I'm not done with it yet. Ock, of course, doesn't have time to reason with Harry, so he dangles him off the balcony. Of course, Harry, being very inexperienced with being threatened like this, immediately loses his composure and offers a deal to Doc Ock in exchange for not being dropped off the balcony, indicating that he's very easy to intimidate into doing Ock's will.
Hey! Stop! Stop! Alright! Put me down! We'll make a deal!
Now, here's the funniest part about this scene. Harry has no guards here. He does not appear to have a gun on him, nor does he have powers of any kind, as he has yet to discover the Goblin Cave hidden in his penthouse. Ock has complete control over Harry here, given that Harry has no hopes of fighting back against him or even escaping from his reach. Ock could have just refused to make a deal with Harry entirely, instead opting to continue dangling him off the balcony until Harry caves into his demands entirely, which can safely be assumed would happen had Ock just played hardball with him. This isn't itself a huge issue, as Otto could have some sort of respect for Harry, given that Harry's company funded his research, but by this point the film has made it very clear that the tentacles have a very strong influence on him.
Doctor, if the artificial intelligence in the arms is as advanced as you suggest, couldn't that make you vulnerable to them?
How right you are. Which is why I developed this inhibitor chip to protect my higher brain function. It means I maintain control of these arms, instead of them controlling me. Something in my head, something talking. The inhibitor chip. Gone. But we need money. Steal it? No, I'm not a criminal. That's right. The real crime would be not to finish what we started.
I don't believe that these tentacles, that are established to have a mind of their own and want to see this mission through by whatever means necessary, would let Otto be this compliant with Harry dictating the terms of their deal at all in the first place, and that's not even going into how insanely bad this deal is for Ock. Harry's deal is that if Ock brings Spider-Man to him alive, Harry will give him all the tritium that he needs. Ock seems to go along with this and asks how he can find Spidey.
How do I find him?
Peter Parker.
Parker?
He takes pictures of Spider-Man for the Bugle.
Ock has no questions about this plan and immediately takes off, with Harry quickly pleading for him to not hurt Peter. The scene flies by rather quickly, giving the viewer less than 30 seconds to process this deal being made, and the fact that Harry's hatred for Spider-Man and his rift with his friend is finally interwoven with the Doc Ock plot makes it seem like a satisfying narrative intersection. After all, Ock knows Harry would have access to the tritium, since Oscorp supplied him with it for the first experiment, and it is a very rare substance.
Precious tritium is the fuel that makes this project go. There's only 25 pounds of it on the whole planet. I'd like to thank Harry Osborn and Oscorp Industries for providing it.
On the surface, this all seems to make too much sense, but let's pause for a minute and really think about all of it. Doc Ock is motivated to see this artificial sun experiment through by whatever means necessary. He has a clear way of getting his fusion reactor source of fuel immediately through Harry, but instead he agrees to hunt down Spider-Man and bring him to Harry in exchange for the tritium, while Harry has no leverage on him other than he knows where the tritium is and Ock doesn't. But again, that's easily resolved by Ock continuing to threaten or assault Harry until he can no longer stand the fear or the pain and gives up the tritium just to make Ock stop. The biggest problem with this plan is the most obvious one. Thanks to this movie adapting the Spider-Man No More arc, Spidey has been absent for some time now, and his tights are hanging up in the office of the Daily Bugle's editor-in-chief. This is public knowledge, as the movie showed issues of the Bugle being printed, with this being the front page story. Whatever exactly has happened to Spider-Man, no one outside of Peter Parker really knows. For all they know, there's a possibility that he's either left New York or has even been killed, but neither Harry nor Ock seem to even entertain that idea. It would be one thing if there was a confirmed Spider-Man sighting earlier in that day, but we know for a fact that there wasn't. Ock is willing to risk his entire plan on the odds of not only Spider-Man still being alive, but also still in New York, and also being easy for Peter Parker to contact strictly on the basis that Peter used to take his photos for a newspaper. While it's a better lead than anything else when it comes to finding Spider-Man, it's still a very weak one. Being the person that takes pictures of Spider-Man does not mean that they would then know who he is or where to find him after he's vanished. Ock also does nothing to make sure that Harry can hold up his end of the deal before going off to hunt down a tough-to-fight superhero who has gone missing, which leads us to the next problem with this scene. What was Ock's original plan when he left his hideout and traveled over to Harry's penthouse? The next scene with Harry reveals that he keeps tritium stored away in a safe behind what appears to be a painting of his mother. There's nothing indicating whether it's been there this whole time or if Harry had to retrieve it from some Oscorp facility first, but either answer will break this scene in its own unique way. If it's the former, then ignoring the absurdity of such a rare substance being kept in Harry's home rather than in a secure facility, did Otto know that the tritium was there this whole time? Because if he did, then then again, all that Ock has to do is continually dangle Harry off a ledge, or just throw and smack him around until he finally gives up and lets him take it straight from his penthouse. However, if Ock was not aware that the tritium was in his penthouse, then that means he traveled all this way expecting Harry to smuggle it from an Oscorp facility and back to his penthouse without going to anyone for help. Ock would not be able to accompany him on this errand due to the way he would stick out like a sore thumb, so Harry would be able to snitch on Ock to the authorities without Ock being able to do anything about it. If the tritium is not already at Harry's penthouse, then Ock accepting this deal means he's willing to hinge his plan on Harry being able to take the tritium from one location to another, as well as being willing to hold up his end of the deal after Ock holds up his, which involves supplying Ock with a substance that he outright says will help him destroy New York. How does Ock know for sure that Harry will fetch the tritium instead of just use Ock to bring Spider-Man to him so he can kill him? Would it have to do with Harry's self-preservation instincts, since Ock would probably kill him if he didn't honor his end of the deal? Well, if that's the case, then why is Harry agreeing to give Ock a substance that will help him destroy New York, which will kill him anyways? Not to mention, Ock doesn't even need to find the actual Spider-Man. Just steal the Spider-Man costume from the Daily Bugle, knock out a random guy with a build similar to Spider-Man's, put the suit on him, deliver him to Harry, and you have your tritium. But no, Ock seems to just prefer to do this the hard way. Why? I don't know, because that's just what really intelligent geniuses like him are supposed to do, I guess. Without even asking where he could then find Peter, Ock then leaves the scene without drawing any attention from the police, as he did from the hospital, from the bank, however many times he had to do it when buying and retrieving the parts for his second reactor, and then from the docks to this penthouse. This movie is not done with having him do that either, and each occurrence of it just exponentially multiplies the number of plot holes. Even if the deal with Harry made any sense, even if Ock didn't have a blade in one of his tentacles, even if we saw how Ock got the parts for his second reactor to his hideout, the amount of times he's just able to go across the city without being pursued by the police without any explanation is comical to me. The entire third act of the movie is driven by a deal which Doc Ock not only should not be agreeing to, but that we can also be sure he wouldn't agree to, given what we understand of his character, and this contrivance affects every ultimate payoff of every plot thread in this film that has nothing to do with Aunt May. It pushes the fusion reactor plot forward. It leads to Ock kidnapping Mary Jane, which brings about the return of Peter's desire to be Spider-Man, and in turn his powers, which then leads to the most beloved fight of the movie, which leads to the emotional payoff of the passengers on the train showing their gratitude to Peter for saving their lives when they promised to keep his secret, and even put their own lives on the line to protect him. It leads to Harry finding out who Spider-Man is. It leads to Mary Jane confirming that Peter is Spider-Man, which in turn leads to her choosing to be with Peter. This one fucking scene playing out the way that it does is what allows all of those things to happen. Doesn't it just suck when all the ultimate payoffs of a story required such a nonsensical setup in order to happen? Alright, so the setup for the third act is exceptionally weak, but it's still not too late for a sensible cause and effect to kick in to at least try to minimize the damage.
I am so tired.
Right, so now we have the car scene. It starts with Peter and Mary Jane meeting up at a cafe. MJ is clearly having second thoughts about her engagement with John, so after Peter expresses regret over trying to talk her out of her engagement and says he thinks his mind was playing tricks on him, she tries to get him to kiss her. Class act, that MJ. And right before they can lock lips, Peter's spider sense goes off, allowing him to detect a car being thrown at him and MJ. Peter then tackles MJ to the ground, helping them both narrowly avoid getting killed by the car. After they get back up, we hear very loud impact tremors being caused by the tentacles. One would imagine that this means that Ock is somehow on top of the cafe that MJ and Peter are in, which would raise even more questions, but in actuality, given how the bystanders start running away from this direction, it seems that Ock was actually too far down the street diagonally to the right of the cafe to even throw the goddamn thing at them in a straight line. This car is not damaged from a single roll by the time it crashes into the cafe, and Ock isn't even fucking visible when they first look out onto the street. So how he actually did throw this car, I don't fucking know. Maybe he's just that good at throwing curveballs, or maybe Magneto owed him a favor or something. It's also interesting how his tentacles are now creating impact tremors from this far away, which makes all the times he's been making his way across New York without running into the police even less plausible if his tentacles cause the ground to shake from that much distance. Oh, speaking of which, yeah, he has once again traveled all this way from the docks to this cafe without being pursued by the police. We don't have any idea as to how Ock even knows Peter Parker is here. Is he following him? If so, how is he following him undetected? Allegedly, he wiretapped Peter's phone, but that is neither in the movie, nor is it explained how he would even be able to do that. Moving on, even though he's a fairly weak one, Peter is still the only lead that Ock has at finding Spider-Man, who he thinks is a separate person from Peter. So as far as he's concerned, Peter doesn't have the capability of dodging a car being thrown at him from behind, or surviving being hit by one, so why the fuck did he risk killing his only lead here? Then of course there's the dialogue in this scene where Peter just straight up tells him that he doesn't know where Spider-Man is, and all Ock has to say is,
"Find him, or I'll peel the flesh off her bones."
Of course, he's acting under the assumption that that even is possible for Peter to do. His only hope of being able to fulfill his end of the deal with Harry relies on a guy who says he doesn't know where a missing superhero is, actually knowing how to find that missing superhero. It's such a fucking shitty deal, why the fuck did he agree to it? Ock then proceeds to slam Peter back first into a brick wall. Slamming someone's back into a brick wall at this force could fucking cripple them. Peter Parker can't be of use to you if he can't even fucking move to get in touch with the person you're trying to capture. And then Ock grabs Mary Jane and escapes with her, presumably to take her to the docks once again without any intervention from the police at any step of the way. Do you guys understand how this is all literally nonsense? Ock is both ridiculously lucky that Peter just so happens to be Spider-Man and is able to both dodge this car and survive getting thrown against a brick wall with this force, and ridiculously unlucky in that he has inadvertently caused Spider-Man to return, which ends up causing his own downfall. Jesus Christ, this is starting to make just as much sense as Holdo's plan, while also being as contrived as Rose and Finn running into a code breaker in a jail cell that they got thrown into while looking for a different code breaker. And that brings us to the most beloved action sequence of the entire movie. I know what you're thinking. No. Don't you dare badmouth the train fight sequence. It is just a known fact that the train fight sequence is great. It's sacred. No one can possibly find anything wrong about it because it's just perfect, and criticizing it would be crazy. Anyways, let's go ahead and look at everything wrong with it so we can criticize it.
Gonna cry?
So of course, after stealing back his costume from the Daily Bugle, Spidey meets up with Doc Ock at the West Side Tower. Again, must have traveled from his hideout to this tower without any fucking interference from the police, and no, I'm not gonna stop pointing it out when he does this, especially after the police have supposedly expanded their manhunt. And once again, we have Ock tanking hits to the face like they're nothing. He is not using his tentacle blade, and his tentacles are doing these weird little movements where they're just waiting their turn to attack Spider-Man one at a time. Wonder where I've seen this kind of fight choreography before. There's also this moment where Ock just casually snaps a large metal clock hand in half and takes much less time to do that than it took for his claws to crush Spidey's skull. Okay. Spidey then manages to grab Ock with his webs. Good thing his tentacles did nothing to prevent that from happening here, despite being shown as capable of doing exactly that in just a minute, and then pulls him down with him. Pretty sure you need this guy alive to tell you where MJ is, Spidey, but okay. The two of them then fall right on top of a train, head first, too, if you pay close enough attention. And yeah, Ock's plot armor is once again becoming rather egregious. Again, he's a regular person. His only powers are the 4 robotic tentacles that are fused with his body. He shouldn't be surviving this. So once they're on the train, we get some pretty cool looking fighting. Then Doc Ock throws Spidey into the air towards a bridge, which Spidey squeezes himself through, and by the time he goes through the bridge, somehow Ock has already passed him. How fucking fast did that train accelerate as soon as Ock threw Spidey? Why is Ock facing away from the bridge to do the shocked Pikachu face as Spidey flies towards him? What was his plan here exactly? Did he not expect Spidey to survive this? I thought that he needed him alive, which is the main defense people try to use for him not even using his tentacle blade to try to wound him in this scene. How does he not get killed or knocked out by Spidey tackling him at this velocity? How does this moment make any sense given what we know about these characters and their power sets? Oh well, who cares? It's cool and that's all that matters, right? Good old rule of cool. The next part of this that doesn't make much sense is that Ock manages to sneakily go from the top of the train to the right side, then underneath the train, and then to the left side so he can knock Spidey off the train. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me as to how he managed to get himself and his tentacles under the train without making any noise, given how noisy his tentacles are established to be when he's moving around, but hey, it's a comic book movie where a guy can shoot webs out of his wrists, so why should we expect things to be consistent? All that matters is the dramatic effect of the moment, right? Then of course the fight comes to an end when Spidey lands behind Ock and just proceeds to do nothing for several seconds as he watches Ock damage the controls of the train. Hit him. 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 Nicely done, Spidey.
What the hell?
Ock then jumps off the train, knowing that Spidey would rather stay on the train in order to stop it instead of going after him. Of course, when we're just experiencing the scene in the moment, we don't take time to process how contrived it all is. First off, don't trains normally have emergency brakes that act as a failsafe when a failure such as damage to the speed controls occur? Why aren't they activating here? Why is it that Ock ripping out this lever means the brakes are gone? How did Ock know that the emergency brakes would malfunction? Of course, this isn't even addressing how far-fetched it is that none of the passengers on the train tried pulling the emergency brakes as soon as Ock and Spidey started fighting on top of it, let alone the conductor not stopping it himself. Look, I know what everyone's going to say. It's a freaking comic book movie. You can suspend your disbelief for a guy crawling on walls and shooting webs from his wrists, but you can't suspend your disbelief for a train not having functional emergency brakes? Suspension of disbelief is not an all-encompassing justification for anything being possible in a story, even when it has elements that are impossible by design, because even with comic book movies, there is still a limit to these breaks from reality. I know that it seems silly to have no issue with obvious science fiction fantasy elements in a story, but then complaining about something relatively minor such as a train not having emergency brakes. But there is a type of uncanny valley to this sort of thing, where something can be not quite as obviously impossible as superpowers, robotic tentacles with AI, or an artificial sun, while being ridiculous enough to cause one to wince. When we watch an Indiana Jones movie, we accept that mystical artifacts exist in that world and can easily suspend our disbelief as long as the rules built around those artifacts are maintained consistently. That doesn't mean we are then obligated to accept this or this. If the argument that we are obligated to accept it was made 12 years ago, you would have been laughed out of film school. Nowadays, it seems like a prerequisite to graduating from it. Likewise, when we watch a Jurassic Park movie, we accept that in this world, cloning dinosaurs is possible, and we suspend our disbelief for that. But that doesn't mean we're obligated to suspend our disbelief for a human surviving being engulfed in a pyroclastic flow. The same logic applies to a superhero movie showing a passenger train in New York City, where everything is super regulated, not having emergency brakes. I don't buy it, and I don't have to. But hey, it's visually impressive and significantly raises the drama of the scene, so maybe we should give these particular breaks from reality some leeway. Or, you know, we could just accept that neither of the dramatic moments are earned due to being built on external inconsistencies that are uncalled for, or we could just bash at Crystal Skull and Fallen Kingdom for their external inconsistencies, while giving Spider-Man 2's external inconsistencies a pass on the basis that Crystal Skull and Fallen Kingdom are bad and Spider-Man 2 is good. That's called sticking to your principles. As it is, the sequence simply doesn't make much sense on paper. But I've got to hand it to Raimi's crew here. It's a testament to their talent that the way the scene is executed makes all these admittedly pedantic questions as easy to miss as they are. But whether or not you miss them, these problems are still there. Of course, the grand payoff to all of this is the passengers on the train swearing to keep Peter's identity a secret. It's a really nice scene, even though it had to come as a result of a nonsensical setup. Also, not sure how these kids caught Spidey's mask when he took it off while on top of the train, but hey, this impossibility only affects him not being immediately identified by Otto or Harry when delivered to him, and that's hardly consequential to the plot, so it can be just easily dismissed as a nitpick. Also very considerate of Doc Ock to not try to take a peek at who Spidey is under the mask, both to Peter and the writers of the film. Also, I have to say, it's hilarious to think that Ock managed to catch up to where this train was when it was going at 80 miles an hour for 2 entire minutes, while once again avoiding the police, just as he avoids them as he's carrying Spider-Man over to Harry's, which takes him until nighttime to do. Harry then pays Ock with the tritium, and Ock then travels all the way to his hideout, evading the police across New York one last time. At the risk of coming off as redundant, I'd like to recap all of these insane teleportations that Ock has been doing throughout the entire movie. He was able to travel from this hospital to the docks, then from the docks to wherever he acquired these clothes he wore to disguise himself to the bank, then from the bank to wherever he went to get the parts for his second fusion reactor, from wherever that place was to the docks, then from the docks to Harry's penthouse, then from Harry's penthouse back to the docks, then from the docks to this cafe that Peter and Mary Jane happened to be at, then from that cafe to the docks again, then from the docks to the West Side Tower, then from this building where he jumped off the train all the way to the end of the railroad tracks, then from the railroad tracks to Harry's penthouse, and then back from Harry's penthouse to the docks, all without being spotted, pursued, caught, or shot by any police. Maybe this isn't as absurd as the several time jumps that each casually skips several 100-mile journeys that the characters in The Last of Us Part 2 have to take across a dangerous post-apocalyptic wasteland. But barring the one where Tommy, Dina, and Ellie inexplicably travel from Seattle back to Jackson while all of them are shot or beaten to shit shit, I can at least say that those are at least within the realm of plausibility. But at no point does this shit with Doc Ock ever become plausible, and once you notice it, you can never unsee it. And it doesn't matter whether it's in something I hate or something I love. In both instances, it's a massive oversight in the story's world building. Harry then unmasks Peter and of course is in shock over the revelation that the man he's blamed for the death of his father has been his best friend all along. Peter reveals that Ock has married Jane, which Harry has somehow remained completely oblivious to for the entire day.
Still no word on the whereabouts of your son's fiance. Sorry, Jonah.
Later that night.
Where is she? He's got MJ.
No, all he wanted was the tritium.
Peter then begs Harry to tell him where Ock is keeping her. The issue is, Harry couldn't possibly know that. Ock never tells him where his new fusion reactor is located, would have no reason to share that information with him, and thus Harry has no leads as to where MJ is located. Seriously, go back and watch both scenes between Harry and Ock. At no point does Harry ever get this information from Ock. Maybe on his way out of the penthouse, Ock dropped a map with the location of his hideout circled in a red marker and they just forgot to add that shot to the movie. Good thing that this plot hole has no relevance to the plot in any way besides allowing the entire climax to even happen. Sure would suck if it was more than just a trivial nitpick. Anyways, Harry is just plain weird in this entire scene. He has no way of knowing where Ock is located, but somehow he just knows. He doesn't care enough about Ock destroying the city to alert the authorities of his whereabouts, even though that means he and Mary Jane may die along with everyone else in New York, but he does care enough about Mary Jane's life to tell Peter so that Peter can come to her rescue once he's told that her life is in danger. Also, need I remind you that tritium is a super rare thing.
There's only 25 pounds of it on the whole planet.
If a bunch of it suddenly goes missing, it would certainly be looked into. So, if Ock conducts this experiment, and the only person in town that has tritium is essentially Harry Osborn, and according to the books, they are missing a huge deposit of it around the same night that the second fusion reactor goes off, and the precedent has been set prior in terms of what the experiment does and what it requires to function, then could it not be said that the police would have sniffed their way to Harry and he could go down for not having said anything about all of this on the night that it happened? He wouldn't be able to claim that his life was threatened because he didn't speak up at all, not even after Ock delivered Spidey to him and ran off with the tritium, and not even after his death. Additionally, any associates of Harry would know that he hates Spider-Man. I mean, he doesn't exactly keep his belief that Spider-Man killed his father to himself.
I'm ruined. I have nothing left except Spider-Man.
He saved your life, sir.
No, pisses me off your loyalty to Spider-Man and not your best friend. I find him with my father's body, and you defend him because he's your bread and butter. And you let him die because he didn't turn in the freak? Isn't that right?
So given everyone who knows of Harry's feelings towards Spider-Man, and given all the witnesses that would have seen Ock fighting Spider-Man on the train earlier that day, not to mention everyone who would have seen Ock carrying Spider-Man straight to Harry's residence, and given all the holes on the side of Harry's building caused by Ock's tentacles, it would not take any effort whatsoever to conclude that Harry made a deal with Ock. Harry should be going down for this. There would be an absolutely airtight case to be made against him, but luckily he lives in a city with a hilariously incompetent police department, so I guess it's fine. So now, at long last, we've reached the climax of the film. Hooray! This entire plot passed the point of no return in terms of making any sense a long time ago, and it feels like beating a dead horse at this point. Unfortunately, the worst has yet to come. What we are about to see Ock do here is what I would like to call a total retroactive decapitation of the entire plot revolving around this fusion reactor. Ock's plan, from the beginning, was this.
We could rebuild. Enlarge the containment field. Make it bigger and stronger than ever.
Up to this point in the film, this line could have been interpreted to mean building a larger fusion reactor while using the same amount of tritium as the last time to keep the next sun small enough to be kept in containment and stabilized. When Ock demands to be given more tritium from Harry, there's at least room for interpretation that he simply wants a higher available quantity of it so that he can chip away at it and perform multiple tests, one drop of it at a time. Remember, the entire purpose of this fusion reactor is to provide the entire world with a self-sustaining source of renewable energy for generations. Now, a key component of this reactor is tritium. A small part of it will have enough energy for a long length of time and produce a miniature sun, and it's also established to be an incredibly rare substance.
There's only 25 pounds of it on the whole planet.
However, now we see Ock deciding to use his entire supply of it all at once for this experiment, which not only will reduce the overall longevity of this reactor's function, which is at odds with Ock wanting his life's work to mean something, but also guarantee a much bigger sun being created, which kind of negates the purpose of enlarging the containment field in the first place. Now, suddenly, this line has taken on new meaning. Ock wasn't talking about making the containment field bigger and stronger than ever, but the sun. Now, why is this a problem? Well, if we are to believe that Otto is a brilliant scientist, scientist, it seems a bit out of character for him to not accept the fact that the first sun was unstable and breached containment despite his calculations supposedly being correct. If he's going to proceed to enlarge the containment field by building a bigger reactor, then it would stand to reason that this larger containment field is designed to more efficiently contain a sun of the same size as the first one, which would allow it to be more stable. However, enlarging the sun as well just makes the enlargement of the reactor pointless, as it means that the next attempt at creating fusion will have the same outcome as the first, only this time the sun will be bigger and thus more unstable. And don't tell me that this is due to Otto's arrogance, because arrogance is not the same thing as stupidity. Otto is supposed to be a brilliant scientist, someone who should understand that making a larger reactor isn't going to do anything differently if he then increases the size of the sun as well. Also, if you pay attention to what exact function his tentacles are designed to do, they appear to be there to push whatever flares that come out of the sun back into it. So I'm not entirely sure what his rationale is for making a sun so big that his tentacles wouldn't possibly be able to do that, since he should know what purpose they're supposed to serve. I'm sure that some will argue that while this plan doesn't make sense to us, it's not really supposed to so long as it makes sense to Otto. The issue with this defense is why would it make sense to Otto? What thought process of his could possibly justify him doing the exact same thing that he did before, only on a larger scale? Well, he's just crazy, you see, so it's fine. Infinity War is far from airtight as far as storytelling goes, but one thing it does have going for it is that while Thanos has clearly earned his title as the Mad Titan, it is easy to understand why at least he thinks his plan will work. He has seen his planet and his people perish because his idea of culling half the population wasn't tried. And then when he did just that to other planets, he claims that it achieved the results he was looking for.
Your planet was on the brink of collapse. I'm the one who stopped that. The children born have known nothing but full bellies and clear skies. It's a paradise.
There's an internal logic to Thanos' madness, but the same just cannot be said for Doc Ock in Spider-Man 2, where he just has no reason to believe that making his next artificial sun large enough to be capable of breaching his larger containment field will achieve his desired results. And it gets even worse when you realize that this isn't just out of character for Otto, but also for his artificially intelligent tentacles, which are characters in and of themselves.
These 4 actuators were developed and programmed for the sole purpose of creating successful fusion.
The key word here is successful fusion. Sucking in everything is not a mark of successful fusion. It is really strange that these robotic tentacles that all have a mind of their own are now prompting Otto to just repeat the same unsuccessful results except on a larger scale. Unless the idea is that they think that the sun sucking everything in actually is a mark of success and they have somehow convinced Ock of that. But I don't know of anyone who would be willing to take that position. Much of the arguments for Ock's character rely on him believing that he's going to save the world with a self-sustaining source of renewable energy that will power up the entire planet. So switching over to him believing that what he's doing will actually lead to the sun sucking everything in would kind of contradict that. Not to mention his redemption coming up in this scene relies on him not wanting the world to be destroyed by his creation in order to make sense. After all of the logistical nonsense that has had to happen in order for this plot to play out the way that it does, and then the deal that Ock would have no reason to agree to doing that drives this third act. This particular decision by Ock to nullify the enlargement of the reactor just about decapitates what remains of the plot. At the 11th hour, the film has revealed that the very premise of its plot was broken. This was apparently Doc Ock's plan this whole time. It recontextualizes everything that has come before it, and not in a good way. So, let's just go ahead and move on to talking about the last fight between Spidey and Ock, shall we? Ock ignores several other prime opportunities to use his tentacle blade on Spider-Man. Then when he finally pulls it out for the second and last time he ever does in this movie, he takes a page out of the Bond villain's handbook and takes his sweet-ass time to actually try to stab Spidey with it, giving Spidey enough time to pull up a giant electrical cord so that Ock can stab that and electrocute himself instead, which is how he is defeated. Gee, if only he just put that tentacle right up against Spidey's chest or just grabbed his head and then drew his tentacle's blade. Also, wait a minute, can we see which tentacle it came out of here? Huh. Top right. Okay. And is that the same tentacle as before? Bottom left. Wait, he has 2? He had at least 2 tentacle blades this entire time. Do you not realize how this now doubles the number of issues caused by him just having 1 of these things? Why has he not been using them constantly? Don't tell me it at least makes sense in the train scene, because he fucking does this to Spidey in that scene. If there wasn't a gap for Spidey to squeeze himself through, he'd have fucking gone splat in that scene. You cannot convince me that would be any less fatal than using 1 or 2 tentacle blades to stab him in the arm or leg so he can't fight as efficiently. instantly. Fuck me, dude. Just fuck this goddamn tentacle blade. Good thing it does nothing except allow the villain to be defeated and then redeemed at the end of the movie. You already know how the rest of the movie plays out. The sun becomes self-sustaining, the abandoned building takes a sweet time to collapse in on itself so that Peter can talk sense into Otto, who manages to take control over his tentacles before then deciding to sacrifice himself to destroy the machine and save New York. MJ finds out that Peter is Spider-Man, Peter drops her off to be picked up by her fiancé and swings off into the night. Willem Dafoe shows up in a scene that reminds you of an even worse movie that you won't want to rewatch. MJ ditches her fiancé at the altar to be with Peter, and the film ends with him swinging towards another emergency as she watches from his apartment. Well, that was something. Yeah, that was truly something.
Oh, that sucks.
As you can see, there's lots of structural issues with this movie that you may not have noticed before. Let's try to wrap this up with a little summary that offers some praise of the film that I've so far withheld, as well as a couple of additional criticisms that I couldn't fit in with everything I've said about Mary Jane and Doc Ock, because I would be remiss to end the video without trying to explore why it is that people love this movie as much as they do, or clarifying that it's still quite easy to love the film regardless of its issues. The Spider-Man No More arc, which I consider to be the heart of the movie, fleshes out Peter Parker and expands on the theme introduced in the first movie very nicely.
With great power comes great responsibility.
And it's because of that theme that I think this arc is a major reason why so many people say that this movie understands Spider-Man better than any other movie that has come out with his name in the title. However, the presence of a theme isn't enough to make the story itself good. How the story with that theme is executed is going to be just as important, and unfortunately, what, or rather who drives this arc, who causes it to even happen, is Mary Jane, a toxic person who has no chemistry with Peter in this movie. It's a rough premise for such an otherwise compelling story to be built on. Some other detractors of this movie seem to list Peter's powers suddenly not working as an issue with the film, but personally I don't agree. I'm not sure if Spider-Man's powers are usually linked to his state of mind in the comics, but even if this was made up for this adaptation of the character, it's a change that I don't really mind, as I don't think that an adaptation being 100% faithful to the source material is what makes it good. I mean, he already has webs coming out of his wrists instead of web shooters in this trilogy. And this particular rule set up in this movie doesn't seem to contradict anything from the previous movie, so I'm pretty much fine with it, although I'm a little confused about how the film really emphasized Peter's desperate financial situation early on, but then dropped that completely after he retired from being Spider-Man. We saw him lose his pizza delivery job at the beginning of the movie, and he would have certainly lost his job at the Daily Bugle once he no longer had pictures of Spider-Man for Jameson to buy from him, but there seems to be no mention of how much worse his financial hardships would be without his photography gig. However, there's still plenty to like about this arc, especially as the clash between Peter's desire to live a normal life and his sense of duty is overall satisfying in how it escalates, but then all that really satisfying growth driven by cause and effect is cheapened due to its ultimate payoff coming about thanks to this nonsensical plan from Doc Ock. Even before that happens though, it's not like the sense of progression is executed perfectly. I found the scene where Peter just walks away from a guy getting assaulted by two muggers simply because he lacks his powers to be grossly out of character for him. I get what the scene is trying to convey, I get that we're supposed to question Peter's actions here, but it really seems to go overboard in how it juxtaposes with him running into a burning building to save a small child later on. In all honesty, by this point it seems like he'd be the kind of person to try to at least help the mugging victim, even if it meant getting his ass kicked in the process. A small fix for this could have been if the muggers weren't just using their bare fists, but were instead holding the guy at knife point or gunpoint, in which case Peter would stand at risk of not just receiving an ass kicking, but actually losing his life as a result of helping, which would have been just as efficient, if not more. So yeah, Peter's struggle with his subconscious desire to be free of the burden of being Spider-Man is a great idea for a story on paper, but in execution, it's a mixed bag for me. The entire plot revolving around Doc Ock is demonstrably made of Swiss cheese. Absolutely nothing works about it. More and more plot holes, conveniences, contrivances, and bizarre inconsistencies, both internal and external, pile on exponentially with each minute that the film passes, and the entire third act of the movie is built on an utterly broken scene where he agrees to an unbelievably shitty deal that only an absolute buffoon would agree to. Moving on from that, the fight scenes may be tension-filled and cool at a shallow glance, but they don't really hold up on a closer look when you factor in what the characters are trying to achieve, their combat capabilities, or how much damage they can believably take. And they're pretty much carried solely by the choreography and editing, and while yes, those things are very important at making a fight scene exciting to watch, these fights are significantly weaker at a consistency level than the ones in just about every single other Spider-Man movie ever made. Spider-Man 2, the so-called holy grail of Spider-Man movies, just isn't well written. In fact, by the same standard that I and many others hold stories to, it is rather poorly written. We first saw this movie when we were 16 years younger and more easily impressed by what we saw in superhero movies, and have clung on to this idea that it's good based on our nostalgia for how much we enjoyed it during our initial viewing. And it's been just blindly accepted as being one of the best superhero movies ever made, simply because so many people say it is.
Gonna cry?
And yet, the funny thing is, I still really like this movie. Yeah, I said it. I didn't make this video with the intent to make people enjoy Spider-Man 2 less. I made it to highlight issues with its story that I think have gone mostly unnoticed, resulting in the film's writing being considered of higher quality than it probably should be, so that maybe the writers of future superhero films can look out for these kinds of issues showing up in their scripts and as a result deliver higher quality content. But sometimes I'm just in the mood for a cheesy, campy, fun superhero movie that doesn't worry about making total sense, and this movie is more than capable of scratching that itch. Just because the plot and fight scenes fall apart the minute you start thinking about them doesn't mean that there was no talent involved in the making of this movie. It's clear that it was a labor of love from everyone involved, and it's always going to be remembered for its iconic moments and influence on modern pop culture's obsession with superheroes. It's just not quite the masterpiece that it's held up to be, but it doesn't really have to be. If anything, the film presents the strongest case that could be made against the style of criticism that I like to engage in, because so many of the people who agree with that standard for writing spent such a long time believing that this movie was genuinely a masterpiece as far as the superhero genre is concerned. It's likely because the movie excels at so many other aspects of the craft that is filmmaking, aspects that all take skill to master, that you could argue that to judge the film solely on its writing would be to miss the forest for the trees. Think about how long it took for these details to be noticed and these questions to be raised, and consider that perhaps a filmmaker being able to effectively misdirect your attention from the internal inconsistencies of their story is a feat worthy of respect in itself, like a well-executed magic trick that effortlessly misdirects your attention from the sorts of things that would take away from the illusion. It really is a testament to the many other strengths of this film that it took so long for these plot-related things to be noticed and really picked apart. The direction, cinematography, and editing are all rock solid. The narrative framework is very solid, the integrity of the story itself notwithstanding, allowing the story to move at a perfect pace, with no scene feeling like it's going on for too long, too short, or throwing too many plot threads at you. And just like in the first movie, Danny Elfman's score is beautifully composed with melodies that are effective at accentuating the intended emotional response of each scene, whether that is sorrow, dread, hope, joy, infatuation, or excitement. Music can do wonders at manipulating a viewer's emotions, even when a movie or just a scene isn't particularly well written or constructed. And this film's score excels at elevating the emotional experience for me, even with all my criticisms in mind. As I just said, on a surface level, the action scenes are all really cool if you don't look at them very closely. As far as the actors are concerned, the performances are good across the board, with the only problem that I can think of being Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst's chemistry. But otherwise, everyone turns in a good performance, with J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson being particularly noteworthy. He is a treasure in this movie. The entire trilogy, really. He steals every single scene he's in and is just as fantastic as I remembered him being, chewing the scenery exactly the way that anyone playing the character should.
Boss, your wife's on the line. She said she lost her checkbook.
Thanks for the good news.
The movie's sense of humor goes back and forth between campy and awkward/uncomfortable, but almost every joke lands effectively and feels appropriate with the tone of each scene, giving the movie a timeless and unique charm that keeps it an enjoyable experience for the most part. There's also a number of individual scenes and moments that hold up really well. Peter talking into a payphone that he doesn't have the change to keep using to leave a message on Mary Jane's answering machine and making the confession that he desperately wants to tell her but also knows that he can't is a really well done scene in its own right, even if it's somewhat bogged down by the context of him saying it to Mary Jane. God, fuck Mary Jane. My favorite scene in the movie, though, might be the one where Peter confesses to his responsibility for Uncle Ben's death to a carjacker that he could have stopped. Well, if we're to ignore the bullshit retcon in Spider-Man 3 that damages this moment, at least. In his video on the Raimi trilogy, Cosmonaut Variety Hour made this really bizarre criticism about how May reacted to this shocking revelation.
At a crucial point in the movie, Peter is like, "Hey, Aunt May, it's been eating me up inside. I basically caused Uncle Ben's death. I didn't know how to tell you, and I'm so sorry. All I want is forgiveness." And she's basically like, "Wow, you're a piece of shit. Bye." And then she just leaves. She leaves him there. Even when Peter comes back and he tries to talk about it again, you know, to get some closure, she's basically like, "Well, you fucked up, but whatever." This is not Aunt May, and it makes me really mad.
May has just learned that her nephew has been secretly living in guilt over his part in her husband's death, which would affect anyone's perception of their family member in this scenario. But deep down, she still loves him and doesn't want to say anything to him that she might regret later out of anger, which is all in character for her. So she removes herself from the situation so that she can process this new information. It's a very relatable reaction for her to have, and honestly was the best one she could have had. It wouldn't be in character for her to turn against him or scold him, knowing that he's already been drowning in guilt for so long, but it wouldn't make sense for her to immediately forgive him for it and let this go. Familial relationships can be difficult, and sometimes you just need to take some time to really process things before saying anything, and as is the case in real life, it ends up being the exact thing she needed to do, as evidenced by the next scene we see her in when she offers words of encouragement to Peter the next time she sees him. Aunt May is like really fucking good in this movie, guys, and the subplot with her learning the truth and forgiving her nephew is pretty much the only one in the movie that I would say is fully functional, as its payoffs are the ones that are least affected by the romance with Mary Jane. Jane in the plot with Doc Ock, and Rosemary Harris completely disappears into her role just as she did in the first movie. I never thought that after this viewing of Spider-Man 2 that I would come away with the conclusion that Aunt May was the best part of this movie, but Aunt May is the best part of this movie, by far. Of course, I know that this video will be compared to CinemaSins because of how detail-oriented I am, seemingly to the point of pedantry, and I know that people are going to say that spotting these kinds of issues is the wrong way to watch movies, or that it's not a legitimate form of film criticism, because gatekeeping is super cool when it comes to analyzing a story's internal consistency, I guess. But I can't help but notice and think about these things when I'm watching a movie. I can't choose to not be bothered by these kinds of issues, or pretend that they don't exist. I am well aware that there are people who think these kinds of discussions are a blight on art, but I'm not here to convince them that my way of looking at things is the only valid way, or that their way of looking at things is less valid than mine. I decided to make this video as a result of an insanely hypocritical backlash I received from the very kinds of people who normally like to criticize stories in this way, and dislike when the kinds of arguments that they use to defend this movie are used to defend movies that they almost define themselves by shitting on constantly.
It seems like your enjoyment of this movie could very easily boil down to that one plot point because so much hinges on it. I guess I'd say pretend for a watch through that it's what you wanted and see how you feel.
It all started with me merely pointing out that the tentacle blade alone causes more issues in this movie than there are in total for Into the Spider-Verse, which wasn't even a declaration that the movie was ruined or bad because of it, just that it wasn't as tightly written as a movie it's often compared to. But that one tweet sent me down an absolutely crazy rabbit hole of double standards from the very people that pride themselves on judging movies objectively. So imagine how I felt when I rewatched the entire movie and noticed all of the issues I brought up in this little video. As mentioned earlier, Spider-Man 2 suffers from many of the same kinds of writing issues that people like me have criticized in other movies. And just like those other movies, when you point them out, you know what you get told by those very same people? You're nitpicking. You hate this movie. Oh, but it was only in one scene. It's just a throwaway action scene. It has no effect on the plot. Well, because you can come up with a hypothetical way to fix this issue in your head, then that means it's not a consequential flaw in the version of the movie that actually exists. Well, I didn't notice it. Well, it didn't bother me. Well, it's cool, okay? Can't you just pretend it doesn't exist? It's a campy comic book movie. Can't you stop taking everything so seriously and just suspend your disbelief? You're right, actually. This is a movie that doesn't want to be taken seriously at all. It's just a campy, gay old time.
Does whatever a spider can. Spins away.
Needless to say, some have resorted to unconventional means when defending their sacred cow. And further down the rabbit hole, we have this.
Okay, so the best way I can think to describe it is just by using it physically. You see, when he catches her, he can open his claws out like this, and wow, look at that. There's no, like, you know, stabby bits going in her. Because he's created a, like, equal platform here. It's really that simple. And it comes from official movie merchandise, but yeah. And yes, they can do this like it's shown in the film. This thing is old and kind of broken, but hopefully you get the point.
I would love nothing more than to explain in full detail the context for how this ended up being made to counter-argue against one of my criticisms of this film, but it would take way too long to elaborate, and it's kind of funnier when presented without context anyways, so if you care to understand more, there is a link to that tweet in the description down below. Literally any criticism can be just hand-waved away with these kinds of pathetic defenses. The only reason that those arguments are made is to minimize and dismiss legitimate issues in a story's writing because you're not comfortable with the realization dawning on you that the thing that you like isn't so structurally sound. So you toss any emphasis on internal consistency and logic out the window because you just don't want to stop believing that it's good. If you've spent the last 3 years ripping on films like The Last Jedi, Jurassic World, Fallen Kingdom, Captain Marvel, Avengers Endgame, Batman v Superman, Suicide Squad, and Justice League for their abhorrent writing, don't cower away to the exact same bullshit defenses that have been trotted out over and over and over again for those films as soon as the exact same standard points out that your precious nostalgic Cape Kino doesn't hold up the way that you convinced yourself it does. You should know better than anyone else not to invoke these fucking moronic arguments. Here's the thing, if a story is actually well written, it will hold up to scrutiny, and if the only defenses that you can come up with are these ones, then maybe you need to reevaluate your assessment of that story's quality. Or, if you would rather continue making up excuses for poor writing simply because of the quality of its presentation, then maybe you should give The Last Jedi another chance. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, and if that means I have to accept that Spider-Man 2, a movie I've always loved and still love, isn't the masterfully written story that I once thought it was, then so be it.
And yeah, you guys find a little mini war on Twitter about all this stuff, right? Because for context, for anybody who's like completely out of the loop, you're thinking to yourselves, wait a minute, live action Spider-Man, that includes the Raimi films, does it not? Why don't you guys deliver your thoughts on the Raimi films for everyone to know?
Can I start, since I'm kind of the one that's leading the charge on this shit?
Go for it.
Spider-Man 2's writing is fucking shit. It's dog shit. There's so much wrong with it. It's kind of stressful to break down, but like there's two main issues that heavily affect the film. One of which is Mary Jane. She's a cunt, and the film doesn't seem to be capable of acknowledging that she's a cunt. And so my emotional investment in seeing Peter get with her, which is like the core stake, like emotional stakes of the film, it's what drives his whole crisis about wanting to be Spider-Man in the first place. I can't get invested in it. I can't get invested in even wanting to see him save her life. She's an awful person. And so there's that issue, which I get, like emotional investment. That's a more subjective thing. On the more objective level, however, there's like one or two scenes with Doc Ock that make like a tiny lick of sense at the very least. Maybe they make total sense even. The hospital scene, and then the scene where he's moping around in his hideout for the first time about his wife's death. Literally every scene besides those two scenes have at least one critical issue with them. The entire plot with Doc Ock does not work in the slightest. There isn't a single fight scene with Doc Ock that functions, that holds up, not even the train fight.
So would you say that if a Spider-Man film had a villain who regularly, like literally every single fight has a huge issue with it, with like say the villain being able to kill Spider-Man whenever, and they just don't do it, that would be a huge problem for the film, right?
I would say it's definitely a problem in the fight scenes, yes. The issues with Doc Ock have more to do with how in the world he's able to get around New York City without the cops stopping him, the fact that he is not bulletproof, the fact that he can be stopped by bullets, and it's just like the film keeps on ignoring the fact that police would exist, that police would be capable of stopping him, and they just don't. You have the logistics of how he gets the parts for his second fusion reactor to his little abandoned hideout in the first place. You have the whole deal that he does with Harry Osborn that kicks off the third act, a deal which makes no sense for him to accept, especially considering the deal is you have to go looking for a superhero who has gone missing, and he's been gone long enough for crime to spike 75%. And your only lead is a guy that took pictures of him for the newspaper. And then, like, especially given that this deal is being dictated, the terms of this deal are being dictated by a guy who literally cracked as soon as Ock started dangling him off a balcony, which indicates that all that Ock has to do is just pick him back up, dangle him off the balcony until he finally completely submits.
Yeah, and Ock isn't even a character right now that's very reasonable. He's kind of he's got one focus, and that is to get that whatever it is, right, the reactor going. Like the idea that it's like, okay, I'll do a favor for you, do a favor for me. That's reasonable. He would. I don't think that's something that appeals to him at that point. Like,
not to mention, it's broken when you consider the fact that he is under the influence of his tentacles, and so it's like, why is Ock even a supervillain, right? Because Otto Octavius, just the man, right? Like if we separate Otto Octavius and Doc Ock from each other, like Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader, as like two different personalities. Otto Octavius is not an evil person. It's the tentacles that are convincing him to, like, basically be willing to hurt innocent people in order to get to his objective. So whatever Otto feels about Harry Osborn, whatever respect he may have for him, I don't believe is going to overpower what the tentacles are going to try to get him to do.
Yeah. Oh, I was gonna say we don't want to spend too long on this because that's
yeah, of course.
That's your arc, all right? We're on a
what
different one.
What I'm just saying is that Spider-Man 2 is terrible on a plot level, non-functional completely. 3 out of 10 easily. However, there's a lot to like about it still, of course, but we can go over that at a different time.
Are you an angel? What?
Aunt May? Aunt May? Is that an angel?
Tell me. Do you bleed?
Punch me, I bleed.
What'd you bring me?